Welcome to week 3 of biblical interpretation and teaching. This is going to be kind of a pivotal week for you in this very short 6-week course. Week 3 is, first of all, going to ask you to select your own pericope. We've talked about that for a couple of weeks now, and we want you to find that passage of Scripture that you can pull out of context and keep the integrity of that passage of Scripture, the completeness of the passage and the story. And we want you to be able to find that and pull that out and select that and then ask 3 questions about that pericope. Now, that's going to differ from student to student depending on what you pick. If you pick a story out of the New Testament, let's say one that comes from Jesus' ministry, the healing of the woman with the issue of blood, that pericope is rather easy to identify. You can see the beginning, the middle, and the ending of that story, and so you're going to pull that out of context. It's going to stay intact. It's not going to be affected in any way by making it its own self-contained little story. But if you choose an Old Testament passage, or if you choose a passage from one of the epistles in the New Testament, the choosing of the pericope can be much more difficult, and there may be some very vital questions that you need to ask about that particular passage of Scripture, regardless of whether it's an easy story to pull out or a more difficult passage. For example, let me use an Old Testament example. If you were going to pull out as your pericope the story of Joshua leading the children of Israel into the promised land across the Jordan River. So it's a very interesting story. It's a wonderful story. It has lots of lessons that can be learned from it. There are lots of spiritual principles at work in that lesson. But as you read that passage of Scripture, you may wonder some things. You may need to ask some very practical and logistical kinds of questions. All right. So we have this huge throng of people, depending on the estimates that you read, perhaps 500,000 people or more that are going to cross the Jordan River. What does that look like logistically? You may have seen pictures of the Jordan River, and you may have seen pictures of a very narrow portion of that river where, maybe it's only 12 or 15 or 20 feet wide, and you think, well, crossing this river really wouldn't be that much of a problem. Maybe one of the questions you need to ask is, what did the Jordan River look like at the time of year when Joshua leads the people across? There is a description there of the flooding that's taking place and the time of year that it is, even where the flooding is taking place. And so you need to ask yourself perhaps some very practical or logistical questions about, what does that river look like at this point? How long would it take this many people to cross? What does that really mean in concrete terms that I could explain as I'm teaching or preaching on this passage? Perhaps the questions you need to ask yourself are some spiritual questions. What are the spiritual principles that I think can be learned from this passage of Scripture? We obviously don't need to go out and go across a river with a large group of people today, but are there some spiritual principles that we can draw out of this passage of Scripture? That's what your assignment is this week, as it has to do with the pericope that you pick out. Now, your discussion this week, I'm looking forward to reading your responses from this. Your discussion this week is based on a sermon by a man named Fred Craddock, one of the great preachers of all time. He is an enormously popular preacher, and he has been well loved for many, many years, part of the Disciples of Christ organization. And I really encourage you to listen carefully to what he has to say. He is very humorous. He is a great storyteller. And the point of this sermon is one I think that just applies to anyone who would listen to it. I can't imagine anyone not enjoying listening to this sermon. So I think you'll have fun with that. and answer the discussion questions about that. All right. Week 3 should be a good week for you. Make sure that you are very careful about that pericope and the questions that you ask and answer about it in your assignment this week, because next week we will move even further into the process of writing that exegetical paper that will be due in week 5. So the preparation work and the foundational work that you do this week in preparation for that paper will be critical. All right. Again, as always, if you have questions or comments, you may email me or contact me in some way, as I've outlined before, and I will get back to you just as quickly as I possibly can. Thanks, and have a great week 3.